Please, somebody answer. She had already called 6 times. Every ring disappeared into silence. No answer. Bruce Bennett was dependable. He wasn't the kind of man who overslept on a Monday morning. He wasn't the kind of son who ignored his mother's calls. And he certainly wasn't the kind of father who left home without letting someone know. As Connie Bennett turned onto East Center Drive, nothing seemed out of place. Fresh snow covered the neatly trimmed lawns. A newspaper lay untouched near the end of the driveway. Children's bicycles rested beside neighboring garages. Not a single police cruiser. Not a single flashing emergency light. It looked like every other quiet winter morning in suburban Aurora, Colorado. But appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Some of the darkest crimes in American history began on streets that looked exactly like this one. Connie climbed the front steps. She knocked once, then again. Bruce. Nothing. Debbie. Still nothing. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Bruce had given her a spare key months earlier, never imagining the reason she would one day need to use it. The lock turned. The front door swung open. The house was silent. Not the peaceful silence of a family still asleep. The suffocating silence of a home where something unimaginable had already happened. She stepped inside. Bruce. No answer. She took another step, then another, and suddenly, she saw him. Her 27-year-old son lay motionless near the staircase. For a brief moment, her mind refused to believe what her eyes were seeing. Then she screamed. Neighbors would later remember hearing that scream. Some would say they had never heard anything like it before. Within minutes, sirens shattered the morning calm. Police officers rushed through the front door. Paramedics followed close behind. As detectives searched the home, each room revealed another heartbreaking discovery. Bruce Bennett, dead. His wife, Deborah, dead. 7-year-old Melissa, just 2 days away from her 8th birthday, dead. Then came one final discovery. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett, alive, barely. Paramedics rushed the little girl to Children's Hospital, where doctors immediately began fighting to save her life. Back inside the Bennett home, investigators stood in stunned silence. 3 murders, 1 critically injured child. No eyewitnesses, no obvious motive, no murder weapon. Whoever had carried out the attack had disappeared into the freezing Colorado night without leaving investigators anyone to arrest. For weeks, then months, then years, the Bennett family murders became one of Colorado's most haunting unsolved cases. Detectives chased leads that went nowhere. Thousands of pages of reports filled filing cabinets. Evidence was carefully boxed and stored away, waiting for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. Then, 34 years later, a routine DNA swab taken from an inmate already serving a lengthy prison sentence uncovered the answer investigators had been searching for since January 1984. Almost overnight, decades of unanswered questions finally began falling into place. But solving the Bennett murders revealed something investigators never expected. This wasn't simply the story of one family. It was the story of a violent drifter whose crimes stretched across multiple states, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives that authorities failed to connect until it was almost too late. It was a case shaped by missed opportunities, outdated technology, and a justice system that, despite its determination, simply didn't have the tools to stop a killer before more innocent people suffered. Today, we're retracing every step of that investigation. We'll examine the evidence, separate fact from speculation, and follow the remarkable chain of events that finally brought one of Colorado's longest-running murder mysteries to an end. Before we begin, I'd like to ask one small favor. Every like, every comment, and every new subscriber helps keep stories like this alive. Families like the Bennetts deserve to be remembered for who they were, not simply for the tragedy that took them from the people who loved them. If you believe forgotten victims deserve to have their stories told with honesty, respect, and care, please subscribe to Cold Case Exposed and become part of a community dedicated to uncovering the truth behind history's most haunting cold cases. Now, to understand how an ordinary family became the victims of one of Colorado's most shocking crimes, We have to go back to an ordinary Sunday evening in January 1984. The Bennett family believed they were ending the day like countless others before it. They had no way of knowing they were living the final hours of the life they had worked so hard to build. Long before their names appeared in newspaper headlines, before television cameras lined the street, before detectives sealed off the house with yellow tape, the Bennetts were simply a young family planning for the future. Bruce Bennett believed in preparation. Friends remembered him as someone who preferred solving problems before they became emergencies. Military service had given him discipline, but it hadn't taken away his kindness. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking. Instead, he was dependable. The kind of neighbor who would help shovel a driveway after a snowstorm or lend a hand fixing a broken fence without expecting anything in return. He wanted more for his family. That dream was leading him toward a career in air traffic control, and almost every evening after work, once the girls had gone to bed, he opened his books and studied. The exams were demanding, but Bruce wasn't discouraged. He believed hard work eventually paid off. Deborah Bennett brought a different energy into the home. She laughed easily. She loved decorating for birthdays and holidays. She kept photo albums, saved children's drawings, and found joy in the little milestones that often passed unnoticed by everyone else. Neighbors would later remember seeing her outside with the girls, bundled against the Colorado cold, building snowmen or watching Melissa ride her bicycle along the sidewalk. Together, Bruce and Deborah represented thousands of young American couples beginning married life in the early 1980s. They weren't chasing luxury. They were chasing stability, a safe neighborhood, a comfortable home, a place where their daughters could grow up without fear. Melissa was the center of endless conversations around the dinner table. At 7 years old, she had developed a personality much larger than her size. She loved asking questions. She loved school. And with her 8th birthday only 2 days away, excitement filled the house. There had already been discussions about cake, about presents, about which relatives might be visiting. To Melissa, the biggest decision in the world was what flavor birthday cake she wanted. To everyone else, there seemed to be countless birthdays still ahead. 3-year-old Vanessa looked up to her older sister in every possible way. She copied Melissa's games. She copied Melissa's words. If Melissa ran outside, Vanessa wanted to follow. The sisters shared a bond that every parent hopes their children will have. A friendship built long before either of them understood how precious it really was. No one could have imagined how dramatically that bond would be broken. The Bennett home reflected the life they were building together. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. Family photographs stood on shelves. Children's toys occupied corners of the living room. School papers waited on the kitchen counter. The ordinary signs of ordinary lives. Ironically, those everyday details would become some of the most heartbreaking photographs investigators documented after the murders. Because crime scene cameras don't just record evidence, they record interrupted lives. Sunday, January 15, 1984, unfolded much like countless Sundays before it. The family spent the day together. Meals were shared. Household chores were finished. The girls played while Bruce reviewed study materials between family responsibilities. Outside, winter settled over Aurora as temperatures dropped below freezing. Inside, warmth filled the house. Nothing suggested that this evening would become the final chapter of their lives together. As bedtime approached, familiar routines took over. Melissa eventually headed to her room. Vanessa followed shortly afterward. Bruce and Deborah finished the last of the evening's responsibilities before preparing for another workday. Sometime during the night, someone entered the home. Investigators would later determine there were no obvious signs of forced entry. Windows remained intact. Doors showed no clear evidence of being kicked open. That detail immediately raised difficult questions. Had something simply been left unlocked? Had the intruder discovered an easy point of access? Or had he quietly entered through a place few homeowners ever imagined someone would use? Those questions would remain at the center of the investigation for years. As daylight spread across Aurora on Monday morning, first responders faced one of the most disturbing crime scenes many had ever encountered. Every room had to be photographed, every object documented, every possible piece of evidence carefully preserved. Experienced detectives understood something important. A crime scene only speaks once. If investigators overlooked even the smallest detail, there might never be another opportunity to recover it. Forensic specialists moved methodically through the house. They searched for fingerprints, hair, fibers, footwear impressions, blood evidence, anything capable of identifying whoever had committed the attack. Outside, snow offered investigators one small advantage. Fresh snowfall sometimes preserves footprints with remarkable clarity. Detectives carefully examined the area surrounding the home, documenting impressions before weather or pedestrian traffic could destroy them. Inside, however, the answers proved much harder to find. No identification had been left behind. No confession waited on an answering machine. No witness stepped forward claiming to have seen someone fleeing the neighborhood during the night. Every passing hour increased pressure on investigators. News of the murders spread rapidly across Colorado. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed special editions into print. Residents who had once considered Aurora remarkably safe suddenly found themselves checking windows before bed. Garage doors that had been left open without a second thought were now closed and locked. Parents began watching their children more carefully. Anxiety spread much faster than facts. Rumors followed. Police departments received calls from people convinced they had seen suspicious strangers days earlier. Others reported unfamiliar vehicles parked along residential streets. Detectives followed every lead. Most ended exactly where they had begun. Nowhere. Still, investigators refused to assume this was a random act. Crimes this violent almost always leave something behind. Some mistake. Some overlooked detail. The challenge was finding it before the trail disappeared completely. And while Aurora detectives worked tirelessly inside Colorado, they had no way of knowing that investigators in neighboring communities were asking remarkably similar questions about remarkably similar crimes. The connection hadn't been made. Not yet. But somewhere beyond the Bennett investigation, a pattern was quietly beginning to emerge. If you've found yourself invested in this investigation so far, I'd like to ask one more favor. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every comment helps more people discover these stories, ensuring victims like Bruce, Deborah, Melissa, and the courageous survivor Vanessa are never forgotten. And if you're new here, subscribe to Cold Case Exposed so you don't miss the next chapter of this extraordinary investigation. In the next chapter, detectives uncover unsettling similarities between the Bennett murders and a series of violent attacks unfolding across Colorado, similarities that would eventually point toward one of the most dangerous offenders the region had ever encountered. For the detectives assigned to the Bennett investigation, every new day began the same way. Review the evidence. Revisit the witness statements. Follow another lead. Hope that somewhere, hidden inside hundreds of pages of reports, was the one detail everyone else had missed. Days became weeks. The Bennett home remained sealed as forensic specialists completed one final examination after another. Every room had been photographed, every measurable detail documented, every piece of physical evidence carefully packaged. Yet despite the painstaking work, investigators found themselves confronting the same frustrating reality. They knew what had happened. They still had no idea who had done it. The Aurora Police Department assembled experienced investigators from multiple units, determined to attack the case from every possible angle. Friends were interviewed. Relatives were interviewed. Neighbors were interviewed. Bruce's military background was examined. His workplace was examined. Deborah's friendships, routines, and recent activities were examined. Nothing immediately suggested a motive. The Bennetts had no known enemies. No significant financial troubles. No obvious disputes that could explain the level of violence investigators had witnessed inside the home. If someone had targeted the family personally, police couldn't yet explain why. If it had been random, that possibility was somehow even more frightening. Because random violence doesn't come with warning signs. Can happen to anyone. The surviving victim remained at the center of everyone's thoughts. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett had undergone emergency surgery almost immediately after arriving at Children's Hospital. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her injuries. Every hour mattered. Family members gathered in waiting rooms, hoping for encouraging news while simultaneously mourning 3 people they had already lost. Medical staff remained cautiously optimistic. Vanessa had survived injuries that, in many cases, proved fatal. But no one could predict what her recovery might look like. Even if she survived physically, investigators knew she would grow up carrying emotional scars that no surgery could ever remove. For detectives, there was another heartbreaking reality. Vanessa had been inside the house. She had survived the attack. But at only 3 years old, she was far too young to provide investigators with the answers they desperately needed. The only eyewitness to the murders couldn't tell them what she had seen. Meanwhile, forensic laboratories continued processing evidence recovered from the Bennett residence. The technology available in 1984 was vastly different from what investigators rely on today. DNA profiling was not yet a practical investigative tool. Modern computerized databases didn't exist. Fingerprint comparisons required painstaking manual work. Every hair, every fiber, every latent fingerprint had to be examined individually. The process was slow, meticulous, and often frustrating. Still, detectives remained hopeful. Violent offenders make mistakes. Sooner or later, they believed one of those mistakes would reveal itself. As news coverage intensified, Aurora residents found themselves living under a cloud of uncertainty. Neighborhood meetings were organized. Home security companies reported increased business. Residents who had rarely locked garage doors now checked them twice before going to bed. Parents reminded children not to answer doors for strangers. The murders had shattered something larger than one family. They had shattered a community's confidence. People wanted reassurance. Police wanted reassurance too. But reassurance requires answers. And answers remained painfully out of reach. Then something unexpected happened. Detectives from another Colorado jurisdiction contacted investigators in Aurora. They weren't calling because they had identified the killer. They were calling because another violent crime had left them asking remarkably familiar questions. The details weren't identical, but there were similarities that couldn't simply be ignored. Another residential attack. Another unsuspecting victim. Another assault involving extreme violence. Investigators compared notes, addresses, timelines, methods, victim information. At first, no one wanted to jump to conclusions. Large metropolitan areas unfortunately experience multiple violent crimes every year. Coincidences happen. Still, the similarities continued piling up. Then another department reported a case with disturbing echoes of the first two. Different victims, different neighborhood. But investigators kept circling back to the same uncomfortable possibility. What if these crimes weren't isolated? What if Colorado wasn't searching for multiple violent offenders, but one? Task forces were becoming more common across the United States during the early 1980s, yet information sharing remained far from perfect. Every police department maintained its own reports, its own filing systems, its own investigators. There was no nationwide digital network instantly connecting evidence across jurisdictions. If detectives wanted information from another department, they often relied on phone calls, mailed reports, or face-to-face meetings. Those limitations created dangerous blind spots. A violent offender could cross county lines, or even state lines, long before investigators realized they were pursuing the same individual. Looking back today, it's easy to connect the dots. In 1984, those dots were scattered across different offices, different investigators, and different stacks of paperwork. No one yet possessed the complete picture. As detectives slowly assembled timelines from multiple investigations, one disturbing observation emerged. The attacks appeared to be escalating. The violence was becoming increasingly severe. That realization changed everything. Because escalation suggests momentum. Momentum suggests confidence. And confidence often means the offender is unlikely to stop voluntarily. If investigators were right, someone capable of killing again was still free. That possibility transformed the Bennett investigation from a tragic homicide into something potentially much larger. Police increased communication with neighboring agencies. Information began flowing more freely. Investigators searched for additional unsolved attacks sharing common characteristics. Every new report was scrutinized. Every possibility considered. Some leads quickly collapsed. Others refused to disappear. The deeper detectives looked, the more they realized the Bennett family might not have been chosen for any personal reason at all. That idea was almost impossible for the families to accept. No motive, no warning, no connection. Just ordinary people whose lives intersected with extraordinary evil. Months passed. The media attention slowly began to fade. New stories replaced old headlines. But inside police headquarters, the Bennett case remained active. Boxes of evidence lined shelves. Maps covered conference room walls. Photographs were revisited again and again. Detectives refused to let the investigation disappear simply because public attention had moved elsewhere. They believed the truth was still there, hidden, waiting. They just didn't know how long it would take to uncover it. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. Every minute you spend learning about cases like this helps ensure that victims are remembered not just for how their lives ended, but for the lives they lived. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to Cold Case Exposed. Together, we can continue shining a light on the cases that history nearly left behind. In the next chapter, investigators uncover a suspect whose violent history stretches across multiple states. Yet despite mounting suspicions, the evidence available in 1984 isn't enough to prove he was responsible, setting the stage for a mystery that will remain unsolved for more than 3 decades. While investigators in Colorado struggled to identify the person responsible for the Bennett murders, events hundreds of miles away were unfolding that would later become one of the most frustrating chapters in the entire investigation. The killer hadn't simply vanished. He had kept moving. In late January 1984, law enforcement officers in Arizona responded to another violent home invasion. This time, the victim survived. The attacker fled, but not before leaving behind enough evidence for police to begin searching for a suspect unlike any they had encountered before. Days later, officers arrested a 23-year-old drifter named Alex Christopher Ewing. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He had worked temporary construction jobs. He moved frequently from state to state. He had no permanent address. People who met him casually often described him as quiet, reserved, and forgettable. He blended into the background. But investigators were beginning to see another side of him. One marked by sudden, explosive violence. To Arizona authorities, Ewing was simply the suspect in a brutal local attack. They had no reason to believe he might also be connected to unsolved crimes in Colorado. And detectives in Colorado had no way of knowing that the man they had spent weeks searching for was already sitting in a jail cell several states away. Today, that sounds almost impossible. But in 1984, it was entirely possible. There was no nationwide system instantly comparing every suspect against every unsolved violent crime. Information moved slowly. Departments focused primarily on their own investigations. Unless someone recognized a pattern or made a specific inquiry, separate cases often remained exactly that, separate. It was one of the greatest weaknesses of criminal investigations during that era. Back in Colorado, detectives continued rebuilding the killer's movements. The more evidence they examined, the more convinced they became that the offender possessed several characteristics. He appeared physically strong. He seemed comfortable entering occupied homes. He showed little concern about confronting victims inside their own bedrooms. Most disturbing of all, his level of violence appeared to increase with each attack. Behavioral analysts believed they were dealing with someone who wasn't motivated primarily by financial gain. Property had often been left behind. Valuables remained untouched. The violence itself appeared to be the purpose. That realization deeply troubled investigators, because offenders driven by violence rather than profit are often among the most unpredictable. Meanwhile, Alex Ewing remained in custody. Had investigators in Colorado known where to look, history might have unfolded very differently. But they didn't. The Bennett murders remained unsolved. Evidence remained boxed. Families remained without answers. Then something happened that would become almost as shocking as the murders themselves. While awaiting legal proceedings, Ewing was transferred through another detention facility. Authorities believed standard security procedures were sufficient. They were wrong. During a scheduled transport stop, Ewing escaped. For a brief period, one of the most dangerous men investigators would later identify was once again free. His escape triggered an immediate manhunt. Police agencies across the region searched highways, neighborhoods, and remote desert terrain. Residents were warned to remain alert. No one knew where he might appear next. The search didn't last long. Within days, Ewing was captured again after another violent assault. His brief return to freedom ended exactly as investigators feared it might, with more innocent victims. This time, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Nevada prosecutors secured convictions that resulted in an extraordinarily long prison sentence. For the victims in Nevada, justice had arrived. For the families in Colorado, justice was still nowhere in sight. Years passed, then decades. Children who had been born after the Bennett murders graduated from college before investigators came any closer to identifying the killer. Police leadership changed. New detectives inherited old case files. Boxes filled with photographs, reports, and forensic evidence moved from one evidence room shelf to another. Cold cases often disappear quietly, not because detectives stop caring, but because every new emergency demands immediate attention. Murders continue. Robberies continue. Missing persons continue. Resources are limited. Time moves forward. Yet some investigators refused to let the Bennett case become forgotten. Among them were detectives who believed advances in forensic science might eventually provide answers impossible to obtain in 1984. That hope kept the investigation alive. Every few years, evidence was reviewed again. Each review asked the same question. Can today's technology reveal what yesterday's technology could not? During the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic DNA testing transformed criminal investigations across America. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Old evidence acquired entirely new value. Investigators returned to countless unsolved murders, searching for biological evidence that earlier generations of detectives had carefully preserved without fully realizing its future importance. The Bennett investigation was among those revisited. Scientists examined preserved evidence using techniques unavailable when Bruce, Deborah, Melissa, and Vanessa were attacked. The results confirmed something investigators had strongly suspected. The same unknown individual was responsible for multiple violent crimes. It was a major breakthrough, but it was only half the solution. DNA can identify a person only if there is another DNA profile available for comparison. Without a matching sample, investigators still faced the same problem. They had the genetic signature of a killer. They still didn't have his name. And somewhere behind prison walls in Nevada, the answer had been sitting quietly for years. No one realized it yet. If this investigation has surprised you so far, you're not alone. Many viewers have never heard how close law enforcement unknowingly came to identifying the killer decades earlier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of Colorado's most remarkable cold cases, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Exposed. Your support allows us to continue researching and telling these forgotten stories with the care they deserve. In the next chapter, a change in DNA collection laws sets in motion the breakthrough detectives had waited more than 3 decades to receive. Within hours, a routine laboratory comparison will accomplish what years of investigation could not, and finally put a name to one of Colorado's most elusive killers. For more than 3 decades, the evidence waited, locked inside sealed containers, stored on shelves, moved from one evidence room to another. It survived changes in police leadership. It survived advances in science. It survived the passing of time itself. What investigators didn't know was that the answer had been sitting in another state's prison system for years. It simply hadn't been asked the right question. By the early 2000s, DNA had become one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators. Cases that once depended entirely on eyewitnesses or fingerprints could now be re-examined using technology that didn't exist when many of those crimes were committed. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies began reopening cold cases. Some produced nothing new. Others changed history. Colorado detectives believed the Bennett murders deserved another look. Forensic scientists carefully reanalyzed preserved biological evidence collected decades earlier. The samples were remarkably well preserved. The testing confirmed what investigators had increasingly suspected over the years. The same unidentified individual had left genetic material connected to multiple violent crimes. It was a significant scientific breakthrough, yet it still wasn't enough. Knowing that several crimes shared the same offender was only part of the puzzle. The laboratory could describe the killer's DNA with incredible precision. But DNA has no name attached to it until it matches another sample. Investigators still didn't know who they were looking for. The case remained frozen. Years passed once again. Families continued waiting. Detectives continued checking for developments. Then something happened that almost no one outside the forensic community noticed. Nevada expanded its DNA collection program for convicted inmates. Thousands of prisoners who had entered the system years before would now be required to provide DNA samples for entry into the national database. It wasn't a decision aimed specifically at solving the Bennett murders. It wasn't even directed toward Colorado. It was simply part of a broader effort to strengthen criminal investigations nationwide. Sometimes, history changes because of a dramatic discovery. Other times, history changes because someone quietly updates a policy. Among the inmates required to provide a DNA sample was Alex Christopher Ewing. By then, he had spent decades behind bars. To correctional staff, it was another routine procedure. Another inmate, another sample, another file. No one collecting that swab could have imagined what would happen next. The sample entered the national database. Computers began comparing it against DNA profiles connected to unsolved crimes across the country. Within an astonishingly short period of time, a match appeared, then another. The unknown DNA profile investigators had carried for decades finally had a name. Alex Christopher Ewing. For detectives in Colorado, the phone call they had dreamed about for years had finally arrived. One investigator later described the moment as surreal. 34 years of unanswered questions, reduced to one notification, one laboratory report. One identity. There was celebration, but only briefly. Detectives still had work to do. A DNA match is powerful evidence. It is not, by itself, the entire case. Investigators knew prosecutors would eventually have to explain the evidence to a jury. That meant reviewing every report from 1984. Every photograph. Every witness interview. Every chain of custody record. Every laboratory analysis. Nothing could be left to chance. The investigation, in many ways, had started all over again. Colorado investigators traveled to Nevada. For the first time, they sat across the table from the man whose name had become linked to one of the state's longest-running murder investigations. Alex Ewing was no longer the 23-year-old drifter police unknowingly missed in 1984. Decades had changed his appearance, but they hadn't changed the evidence. Investigators confronted him with the DNA findings. For more than 3 decades, the evidence waited, locked inside sealed containers, stored on shelves, moved from one evidence room to another. It survived changes in police leadership. It survived advances in science. It survived the passing of time itself. What investigators didn't know was that the answer had been sitting in another state's prison system for years. It simply hadn't been asked the right question. By the early 2000s, DNA had become one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators. Cases that once depended entirely on eyewitnesses or fingerprints could now be re-examined using technology that didn't exist when many of those crimes were committed. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies began reopening cold cases. Some produced nothing new. Others changed history. Colorado detectives believed the Bennett murders deserved another look. Forensic scientists carefully reanalyzed preserved biological evidence collected decades earlier. The samples were remarkably well preserved. The testing confirmed what investigators had increasingly suspected over the years. The same unidentified individual had left genetic material connected to multiple violent crimes. It was a significant scientific breakthrough, yet it still wasn't enough. Knowing that several crimes shared the same offender was only part of the puzzle. The laboratory could describe the killer's DNA with incredible precision. But DNA has no name attached to it until it matches another sample. Investigators still didn't know who they were looking for. The case remained frozen. Years passed once again. Families continued waiting. Detectives continued checking for developments. Then something happened that almost no one outside the forensic community noticed. Nevada expanded its DNA collection program for convicted inmates. Thousands of prisoners who had entered the system years before would now be required to provide DNA samples for entry into the national database. It wasn't a decision aimed specifically at solving the Bennett murders. It wasn't even directed toward Colorado. It was simply part of a broader effort to strengthen criminal investigations nationwide. Sometimes, history changes because of a dramatic discovery. Other times, history changes because someone quietly updates a policy. Among the inmates required to provide a DNA sample was Alex Christopher Ewing. By then, he had spent decades behind bars. To correctional staff, it was another routine procedure. Another inmate, another sample, another file. No one collecting that swab could have imagined what would happen next. The sample entered the national database. Computers began comparing it against DNA profiles connected to unsolved crimes across the country. Within an astonishingly short period of time, a match appeared, then another. The unknown DNA profile investigators had carried for decades finally had a name. Alex Christopher Ewing. For detectives in Colorado, the phone call they had dreamed about for years had finally arrived. One investigator later described the moment as surreal. 34 years of unanswered questions, reduced to one notification, one laboratory report, one identity. There was celebration, but only briefly. Detectives still had work to do. A DNA match is powerful evidence. It is not, by itself, the entire case. Investigators knew prosecutors would eventually have to explain the evidence to a jury. That meant reviewing every report from 1984. Every photograph. Every witness interview. Every chain of custody record. Every laboratory analysis. Nothing could be left to chance. The investigation, in many ways, had started all over again. Colorado investigators traveled to Nevada. For the first time, they sat across the table from the man whose name had become linked to one of the state's longest-running murder investigations. Alex Ewing was no longer the 23-year-old drifter police unknowingly missed in 1984. Decades had changed his appearance, but they hadn't changed the evidence. Investigators confronted him with the DNA findings. When Alex Christopher Ewing arrived back in Colorado, the investigation that had consumed generations of detectives entered its final chapter. For some investigators, it was the first time they had ever seen the man whose name had haunted thousands of pages of reports. For others, it marked the end of a journey that had begun decades earlier. But the courtroom would decide whether the evidence was enough. Because after 37 years, the burden of proof remained exactly the same. The prosecution still had to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial opened with a simple question. Could science finally answer what investigators had been unable to prove in 1984? Prosecutors carefully reconstructed the events of January 15, 1984. They walked jurors through the Bennett home. They described the family's ordinary Sunday evening. They explained how investigators processed the crime scene. Then they introduced the evidence that had transformed the case. DNA. Forensic experts explained how biological evidence recovered from the investigation had been preserved for decades before modern testing techniques identified the contributor. They described how advances in forensic science made comparisons possible that investigators in 1984 could never have imagined. To the prosecution, the evidence formed one unmistakable conclusion. The same individual responsible for the DNA evidence was the man sitting at the defense table. Alex Christopher Ewing. The defense challenged that conclusion. Attorneys questioned the handling of evidence collected decades earlier. They reminded jurors that crime scene procedures in 1984 differed significantly from today's standards. They pointed out that investigators had not recovered fingerprints identifying Ewing inside the Bennett home. They argued that the passage of time created opportunities for mistakes. Their message was straightforward. DNA alone, they argued, should not erase every unanswered question surrounding the investigation. Jurors listened carefully. It was exactly the kind of debate the justice system was designed to examine. Not emotion, evidence. Not speculation, proof. Witnesses described the investigation. Forensic experts explained laboratory procedures. Detectives recounted years of work that eventually led to identifying Ewing as the suspect. One by one, the pieces of the investigation came together. The prosecution argued that while individual pieces of evidence might seem incomplete when viewed alone, together they formed a compelling picture. The defense maintained there were still gaps. That was ultimately for the jury to decide. Among the most emotional moments came from the surviving victim, Vanessa Bennett, the little girl who had been only 3 years old on the night her family was attacked, was now an adult. She had spent most of her life carrying the physical and emotional consequences of a crime she was too young to fully remember. She survived. But survival came with years of surgeries, rehabilitation, recovery, and the unimaginable reality of growing up without her parents and older sister. No verdict could return what had been taken from her. No sentence could erase decades of loss. But after nearly 4 decades, she finally had the opportunity to see the man prosecutors said was responsible held accountable in a courtroom. For many watching, it was impossible not to think about the little girl paramedics carried from the Bennett home in 1984. Against extraordinary odds, she had lived long enough to witness the conclusion of the investigation that began before she was old enough to understand it. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. Prosecutors urged jurors to consider the totality of the evidence. The defense reminded them that every defendant is presumed innocent unless guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, the jury retired to deliberate. For investigators who had devoted years of their careers to the Bennett murders, waiting for the verdict felt strangely familiar. They had spent decades waiting for answers. Now they waited one final time. The jury returned. One by one, the verdicts were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Alex Christopher Ewing was convicted in connection with the murders of Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, and 7-year-old Melissa Bennett, as well as the attack on Vanessa. For the Bennett family, it was not a celebration. There are no celebrations in cases like this. There was relief, there was gratitude, and there was the quiet understanding that justice, although delayed, had finally arrived. The court later imposed multiple life sentences, ensuring Ewing would spend the remainder of his life in prison. It was the legal ending to a case that had once seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The Bennett investigation became more than a solved cold case. It became a lesson, a reminder that evidence carefully preserved today may answer questions decades from now. A reminder that advances in science can succeed where earlier investigations reached their limits. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that investigators who refuse to give up can change history. Had detectives discarded evidence? Had forensic scientists failed to preserve biological samples? Had later investigators decided the case was too old to revisit? The Bennett family murders might still be unsolved today. Instead, patience, persistence, and scientific progress finally brought the truth into the light. The Bennett home no longer stands as it did in January 1984. The neighborhood has changed. Families have moved. Children who weren't yet born when the murders occurred now raise families of their own. Time has continued moving forward. But for those who loved Bruce, Deborah, Melissa, and Vanessa, January 15, 1984, will never simply become another date on the calendar. It remains the day everything changed. Bruce never became the air traffic controller he had worked so hard to become. Deborah never watched her daughters grow into adulthood. Melissa never celebrated her 8th birthday. Vanessa endured a lifetime shaped by one unimaginable night, yet demonstrated extraordinary resilience in rebuilding her life. Their story deserves to be remembered not because of the violence that ended it, but because of the ordinary, hopeful lives that existed before that violence arrived. That is what every cold case ultimately represents. Not a file, not a headline, not a courtroom exhibit. Family, a future that should have happened, and people whose names deserve to be spoken long after the investigation is over. Thank you for joining us for this journey through one of Colorado's most significant cold cases. If this documentary helped you better understand the Bennett family murders, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Exposed. By subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with others, you help ensure that victims are remembered, forgotten investigations continue to receive attention, and the remarkable work of detectives, forensic scientists, and prosecutors is never overlooked. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Do you think modern DNA technology has fundamentally changed the future of cold case investigations? Are there other historic unsolved cases you believe deserve renewed attention? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never forget that sometimes justice doesn't come quickly, but with enough determination it can still find its way home.